What happens when a former U.S. president writes a letter meant to caution, but gets an answer that shakes the global order? In a world where African leaders were once expected to nod quietly, one man picked up his pen and declared, "Enough." Billy. Clinton sent a letter meant as advice. What he received in return was a mirror, a reckoning, a voice that refused to be small. This is not just a response. This is a turning point, a continent rising, not with anger but with clarity. It was a quiet dusk in Ouagadougou, the kind of golden evening that blankets the capital with an almost sacred stillness. The air was thick with the scent of dust and bougainvillea, and the calls of distant vendors echoed faintly through the palace corridors. Inside the presidential office, a single desk lamp cast a pool of light on a polished wooden desk, a desk now holding a letter with a seal that carried global weight. It was a letter from William Jefferson Clinton, 42nd President of the United States. The envelope had arrived hours earlier via diplomatic courier, stamped with the emblem of the Clinton Foundation and marked personal. Courteous, even warm, but unmistakably political. President Ibrahim Traoré opened it slowly, his fingers steady, his expression unreadable. He read the letter once, then again. Clinton's tone was measured, part counsel, part caution. It acknowledged the bold reforms underway in Burkina Faso, but voiced unease about the nation's trajectory away from Western alliances. It warned of unintended isolation, of emerging influences whose long-term motives, he wrote, might not align with the well-being of the Burkinabe people. Dear President Traoré, it began, your courage has drawn the world's attention, but your course, though noble in intention, risks leaving Burkina Faso without the partnerships that fuel sustainable progress. I urge you to remember that shared values, democracy, stability, cooperation, are not Western ideals. They are human ones. The letter was sincere. It bore the weight of experience. But to Traoré, it also carried a familiar undertone, the subtle expectation that Africa must choose a lane carved by others rather than pave its own. He folded the letter neatly and set it aside. Outside, the palace staff moved quietly, unaware that behind those walls something deeper was stirring. Not indignation, but clarity. Later that evening, Traoré sat down with a pen and plain paper. No aides, no dictated drafts, just the steady voice of a man who had seen too much, waited too long, and now spoke not just for a country, but for a continent waking up. Dear President Clinton, I thank you for your letter. I receive it not as a warning, but as a gesture of concern, and for that I offer my respect. You have long been a friend to Africa, and I do not question your sincerity. But allow me to speak without pretense. Africa is not confused. Africa is not lost. Africa is not in need of direction. Africa is awake. And with that awakening comes a decision long overdue, to no longer explain, but to assert. To no longer ask, but to act. He paused, recalling his days as a young officer, walking through villages where children studied by candlelight, where hospitals lacked basic equipment, and where food aid arrived with logos but no understanding. He remembered standing beside women who had survived civil unrest only to be told by foreign advisors how resilience metrics were improving. He continued writing. The challenge is not that Burkina Faso is turning away from the world. The challenge is that we are turning toward ourselves for the first time in a generation, and in doing so, we are discovering something powerful. That progress is not something granted, it is something claimed. You speak of democracy. So do we. But let us be clear. For too long, democracy in Africa has been reduced to elections without electricity, constitutions written in colonial languages, and institutions monitored more by donors than by citizens. What we are building is not a rejection of democracy. It is a reclamation of its soul. Here, democracy means the right of a farmer to irrigate his field without waiting for permission from a Western lender. It means a village school run by locals, not by consultants. It means that when we speak of freedom, we do so not in theoretical terms, but in the reality of owning our choices, our resources, and our future. Traoré rose from his desk and walked to the window. Ouagadougou shimmered in the distance, dotted with solar lights installed under his administration's rural electrification initiative. In the street below, a group of young men gathered around a vendor's radio, discussing the latest national program aimed at reducing foreign dependency. Back at his desk, he resumed, "I understand your concerns about uncertain allies. But let us be honest, Mr. President. Certainty has not served us well. Certainty built roads we did not request. Certainty delivered aid with strings. Certainty erected embassies that listened to each other more than to us. What we seek now is not certainty. We seek clarity in our purpose, in our partnerships, and in our power. And that clarity tells us no nation, not even ours, can grow on borrowed vision." Traoré reflected on a recent visit to a rural town near Koudougou. There he had met a 23-year-old woman named Fatima, who ran a cooperative that processed locally, harvested hibiscus into export-grade tea. With support from the government's enterprise fund, her group had gone from barely surviving to supplying cafes in Ouagadougou and Abidjan. Fatima had looked him in the eye and said, "We are no longer begging. We are becoming." That sentence echoed in his mind as he concluded his letter. "Mr. Clinton, you once said that the price of doing nothing is far greater than the price of doing something. We agree, but our something may not look like what others expect. It may not follow old models. It may not wait for approval. It may disturb those used to shaping Africa's narrative without Africa's voice. But make no mistake, it is rooted in love for our people, pride in our culture, and faith in our capacity. Africa is not closing its doors. Africa is building its house. And this time, we are choosing the architects. With respect, Ibrahim Traoré." In Washington, D.C., Bill Clinton was asked about the letter during a symposium at Georgetown University. He paused for a moment before responding. President Traoré's words were honest, and sometimes honesty stings. But that's the kind of leadership the world needs. Voices that challenge, not just comply. He added, "Africa is speaking, and it's time we listen, not just hear." Back in Burkina Faso, the response rippled far beyond headlines. In villages across the country, citizens spoke with pride. In a market near Fada-Ngourma, a merchant said, "This is the first time I feel like my president is not speaking to the world, but for us." In a small classroom outside Banfora, a teacher pinned a printout of the letter to the wall beside a map of Africa. She told her students, "This is what dignity looks like. This is why you must study, not to leave but to lead." Meanwhile, Traoré's administration accelerated its development agenda. The Minister of Education rolled out a nationwide teacher training program using local languages as the primary medium of instruction. The Ministry of Health finalized a deal with regional partners to produce essential medicines domestically. The Agriculture Department expanded access to cooperative-owned grain silos, reducing the influence of foreign commodity traders. At a town hall meeting broadcast on national radio, Traoré stood before hundreds of students and community leaders. "I do not ask you to follow," he said. "I ask you to stand, not because we reject the world, but because we finally accept ourselves. We welcome aid, but not dependency. We welcome friendship, but not guardianship. We welcome the world, but on our terms." The crowd erupted in applause. Weeks later, during a quiet visit to a community workshop near Kaya, a girl named Issa handed Traoré a charcoal drawing, him standing beside a tree, its roots deep and unshaken. She said, "This is you, and this is us. We grow because the roots are strong." Traoré looked at the drawing, then at the girl. "No," he said softly. "You are the roots. I am just the soil that holds you." And across the globe, one thing became clear. Africa was no longer asking to be seen. It was defining how it would be known. And in the quiet corridors of power, from Brussels to Beijing, the message was heard not as a whisper but as a drumbeat.